12th century Portugal was a land chock full of brave knights, but perhaps the bravest among them was Martim Monez, the hero of Lisbon and villain to all doors he may enter. In 1147, as part of the otherwise unsuccessful Second Crusade, the Templar King of Portugal, Alfonso I, conducted a swift and victorious campaign which he hoped to end with besieging the Muslim-controlled city which would one day become Portugal's capital, Lisbon. The coalition crusader force of Portuguese, Germans, Normans, English, and Knights Templar surrounded the city and demanded its surrender, for which the Muslims declined. What followed was a siege of attrition for nearly 4 months. Martim Monez was a knight of noble birth, well respected by his comrades for being brave and comfortable in the front lines of battle and going through doorways. Although he was of good birth, we don't know much about the man before his posthumous shining moment. At some point during the siege, the starving defenders desperately sallied out of Lisbon and began shooting arrows at King Alfonso's personal force. To push these men back behind their walls, a group of knights made a charge on foot towards the open gate. After getting a few more shots off, the defenders hurried back inside. One knight in particular was well ahead of the others. When the last defender made it back to the safety of the walls, the Muslims began closing the gates. And that's when they realized. The fast and brave Portuguese knight had pushed his own body between the closing door. Martim Monez was crushed as his accomplices caught up to him. I hope his death was very quick, or else it was probably one of the worst ways to ever die. The Muslims could not remove his body from the door before the Portuguese knights arrived behind their crushed hero. After fighting with Martim Monez between them, the Christians were able to take the gate and enter the city, leading to the eventual conquest of Lisbon. While Martim Monez is undoubtedly one of the most suicidally bravest men in history, his story and death might not even be real. While we are sure that he was a real person, as was his son, his story is likely extremely over-exaggerated and more legend than history. Lisbon was surrendered on contractual terms after a hole was blown in its wall. Perhaps it was a door of a house he lodged himself into or something along those lines. His death was likely propagated by King Alfonso and the Crusaders, a testament of how far someone should go to defeat the armies and cities of Islam. In honor of Martim Monez, the gate that he was supposedly stuck in was named after him in his honor, as well as a train station in Lisbon, which has this very child-friendly drawing of Martim Monez being brutally crushed to death. To commemorate Martim Monez, let's take a look at what Reddit has to say about his death. Jason6 said, "That guy definitely had a side better than the other for the open casket." Spoon Roof said, "Brother, I am pinned here." My personal favorite is what Mouth of the Carp had to say, which was, "The doorway to heaven." Medieval-era mercenaries are notorious for being less than loyal, gold being the only respite to service their sword arm. Of these rogue knights and warriors, there is one who stands tall as the most controversial, competent, and greedy. A man capable of making both the Byzantines and Turks tremble in a war-torn Anatolia. The ever-opportunistic Roger de Flor. Roger was born in the heel of Italy in the year of 1267, at the port city of Brindisi. The son of a minor Italian noblewoman from a merchant family, while his father was a trained falconer who served the Holy Roman Emperor, Frederick II Hohenstaufen. He was named Richard von Blume. Blume means flower in German, and so does Flor in Italian. Before you could even remember, Roger was exposed to the tragedy that befalls the brave. Before his first year of life was complete, his father, who was said to be an expert warrior on his own accord, would follow his liege, King Conradin, into battle to decide the fate of the Kingdom of Sicily. the 16-year-old and final male member of Germany's Hohenstaufen dynasty, where names such as Frederick Barbarossa dominated the politics of the Holy Roman Empire. In recent years, the war between this family and the Pope, most commonly referred to as the Guelph-Ghibelline conflict, would come to one of its bloodiest conclusions. At the Battle of Tagliacozzo, the papacy-backed army of Duke Charles of Anjou would find their way to victory after initial upsets. Here, Roger de Flor's father would be struck down and killed in the heat of battle. The result of this conflict would see the last member of the Hohenstaufen dynasty executed by the Pope, and the Kingdom of Sicily would fall into the hands of the French-born Charles of Anjou. The Pope had secured his south, and Roger de Flor was now living in the domains of the man who had killed his father and taken his inheritance from the Flor family. With his father dead, Roger, along with his brother, Jacob, who was 4 years older than him, were entrusted into the care of their maternal grandfather, a wealthy and unnamed merchant from Brindisi who would raise the brothers through their formative years. At the age of 8, Roger de Flor would begin his first of many adventures into the East. Where his father was a skilled soldier and royal falconer, his son would follow a similar, albeit different path. Roger would become a squire in the esteemed order of the Knights Templar. By this point in the year of 1275, the Templars were a shell of their former glory. The Crusades for the Holy Land were failing, and only remained alive with a few cities dotted along the Levantine coast. This only presented a new challenge for the Order of Knights to reconcile for their fresh new recruits. Away from the heavily armored lance-wielding warriors that we know so well from popular culture, the Templars began far more extensive training in their navy in order to connect the last few coastal bits of Outremer. 10 years later, in 1085, Roger became the captain of his own ship, dubbed the Falcon, in honor of his father's own occupation. The Falcon, with Roger at its helm, was one of the fastest galleys in the Templar fleet, making it all the more important as a trading vessel, as well as a means of escape. By 1291, the domain of the Crusaders in the Holy Land was reduced to one key stronghold, the city of Acre. In April of that year, the last chapter in this 200-year conflict would come to its long-awaited climax. The Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt began their siege on April 4th. It only lasted for a little over a month before the city fell. The final stages of the battle would see the Crusaders defending the port and evacuating as many knights and treasures as possible onto their many fleets, Roger de Flor's Falcon being among them. Here, the true colors of this ambitious man begin to shine through. Entry onto the Falcon would not be a free ticket. Roger called for everyone to pay for their place in gold, refusing the request of his Templar brethren. This treasure, Roger would use to enrich himself before dropping the survivors of Acre off on the nearby island of Cyprus. Having swindled his fellow Christians and knights, the Pope excommunicated Roger de Flor, while the Templars kicked him out of their crumbling order. Now a man on the run, decided to abandon the Falcon and embrace a life of banditry. His situation couldn't get any worse after all. With his skill on the sea behind him, he went to the home of one of the greatest merchant fleets of his day, the Republic of Genoa. He borrowed money from a wealthy duke, never paid him back, bought a new ship, and began looking for a master more willing to accept his brand of warfare. It would be opportunity that brought him into the service of King Frederick III of Sicily, and his father, the King of Aragon. And it would be revenge that would motivate him to attack King Charles II of Naples. the father of the man who had conquered southern Italy and killed Roger's dad when he was but a helpless infant. Here, Roger de Flor would become the Jolly Roger, a pirate mercenary who would raid coastal settlements in Sicily and beyond, striking any vulnerable coastal settlement before returning to his ship in a flash. For 7 whole years, Roger de Flor would continue on in this piratical trend, becoming a menace to his southern Italian homeland and building a fleet by acquiring boats from his victories and purchasing them from Sicilian ports with the money he earned from his privateering. Roger de Flor was becoming a skilled businessman, the merchant maternal roots of his ancestors shining through him. In Sicily, Roger found the most success, creating his own small army, made up of soldiers called the Almavagars. These men were from the Iberian Peninsula, veterans of the Western Crusade, more commonly referred to as the Reconquista. These foot soldiers were made up of mostly lightly armored spear units, which could be used to counter the heavily armored knights of Naples with relative ease. They carried with them 2 to 3 javelins which they would throw before engaging with their fighting spears. They also held a small sword called a falchion. Although they were lightly armored, their speed ensured any strategic advantage when used in the right hands. And that's just who Roger de Flor was. In 1302, the war for Sicily had ended, and Roger de Flor and his mercenary company were out of work. And out of gold. A revolt likely would have started on the island if it was not for the Reaver Lord of the Flower. With his wealth only growing after being excommunicated, Roger de Flor hired all the Almavagars he could acquire and founded the Catalan Company, one of the most well-known mercenary companies in history. With nowhere in particular to go, Roger decided to take his 6,000-strong army and sail them as far away from the Pope as he could, without starting another crusade, that is. Soon enough, Roger de Flor found himself in the Byzantine court of Emperor Andronicos II Palaiologos. With the Eastern Roman Empire firmly on the back foot after the Fourth Crusade, and numerous invasions of the Turks in Anatolia, the Emperor was desperate for military aid. Who better than a former Templar to subdue the Turks? Seeing the aged empire so in need of assistance, the opportunistic Roger de Flor decided to milk out everything he could. After all, how could they begin to reject the Almavagars? He only agreed to fight on behalf of the Emperor if he could be married into his family. For this, Andronicos gave Roger his niece, a Bulgarian princess named Maria. Roger was also given the titles of Grand Duke, as well as Commander-in-Chief of the Eastern Fleet and Army, which at this point was an empty title that Roger and the Catalans now filled. Hurriedly getting the army of Westerners away from Constantinople, Roger de Flor's band of mercenaries boarded their 22-boat fleet and made their way for Cyzicus, one of the vital ports that dotted the insular Sea of Marmara. Here, the Catalan Company crushed the Turks and liberated Cyzicus. After spending a winter there, Roger and the Almavagars sped their way across the Anatolian coast until reaching the city of Philadelphia, which at this point was completely surrounded and near the end of a long siege. In what was perhaps his shining moment, Roger forced the besiegers of Philadelphia to retreat and claimed victory over the Turks of Anatolia yet again. The light infantry of the Catalans could not be bested by the cavalry-composed armies of the numerous Turkic beyliks. After becoming experts over the armies of Moors in the Reconquista, The Almogavars represented the tactics of the Western Crusade, successfully overcoming tactics in what was the tail end of the Eastern Crusade. The arid fields of Catalonia were not so different from that of Anatolia. For a little over 2 years, Roger de Flor was the undisputed master of Eastern Anatolia. He arrested and executed many of the remaining Byzantine governors and nobles who had made deals with the invaders. He was starting to become his own governor in Anatolia, and surely could have become his own king. As was his way, the rogue mercenary knew his importance and used it against his employer. Having free reign in the east meant that he could take all of its spoils, which was supposed to go to Constantinople. While this enriched himself, the Byzantines took this as payment and refused to monetarily support the Catalan company. With the Catalans only rising in power, the Byzantine emperor thought it high time for Roger de Flor to pay. The mercenaries were invited back across the sea to the edge of Europe, while Roger was given the illustrious title of Caesar. But this was only a ploy, as he and his officers were invited to the city of Adrianople to discuss new terms for their contract. Here, the overconfidence of Roger finally caught up to him. Without his mercenary band he thought so indispensable to the Byzantines, Roger was assassinated, Red Wedding style, ambushed during a feast. With Roger dead, the rest of the Catalan company went on a rampage across the Byzantine West, conquering Athens and creating their own duchy. Here they would remain for some time in defiance of the empire who had betrayed their leader. Roger de Flor was, for all intents and purposes, a man of exceptional skill and equal amounts of greed. Like any good mercenary captain, he wanted the most wealth for himself and his soldiers. Although he was excommunicated and disbanded from the Knights Templar, he showed the true face of that late order of warrior monks. He did not hide his greed unlike most of them. Not only was he first and foremost a great admiral, but he defeated the Turks of Anatolia on the battlefield when no one else could. Although his hijinks caught up with him in the end, for a moment in time he was the most feared pirate and mercenary of his day and age. A ship docks in the port of Calabria, a city in the medieval Italian kingdom of Naples. Crammed in the hull was a precious cargo of slaves from sub-Saharan Africa. Nobody would have guessed that one of these men, far from home and destitute, would rise to the top of the noble hierarchy of this land, and come to own much of it. This is how an African knight dominated medieval Italy. While many historians know the story of the African samurai, Yasuke, and his rise to power, even fewer know his less famous, knightly counterpart in the West, the clever and politically shrewd Raymond of Campania. Our story starts somewhere below the Great Sahara Desert. A boy was born, not a noble, although he would become one in a land far, far away, past the mountains, desert, and sea. We are left with very little to pick over regarding the early life of the man who would become known as Raymond of Campania. All that's left in the historical record is a distant origin which plants him as an Ethiopian. During this time in medieval Western Europe, calling someone an Ethiopian was just a catch-all phrase for black people. Raymond was certainly not from Ethiopia, as this is a land far from Italy and mostly Christian, a religion that the young Raymond had no recollection of. Sometime in his youth, he was captured by slavers and brought across the Great Desert. Once reaching the waters of the Mediterranean, he was chained alongside other Africans to a boat in modern-day Tunisia. many of which spoke a language he could not comprehend. These Barbary pirates took their precious cargo to the Kingdom of Naples, located on the southern boot of Italy. At this time, the Tunisian Hafsid dynasty and the Kingdom of Naples had a strange trading dynamic, to say the least. Since 1275, a trade agreement was signed between the two nations. The Kingdom of Naples requested one thing: stop selling your own subjects to us as slaves. Not because they viewed it as wrong, only because it was all too easy for those same slaves to cross the sea and escape back to Tunisia. To prevent this, the Tunisians resorted to capturing slaves from interior Africa, such as the star of our story today. After a short crossing of the Mediterranean, the slaves were brought to the toe of Italy, a region known as Calabria, a land under the direct control of the future King of Naples, Robert the Wise. Checking these newcomers for signs of Tunisian heritage, he sent them onward to the capital and namesake city of Naples. Here, the young slave was purchased sometime in the late 13th century. His new master was the head chef of King Charles the Lame, who, yes, was not the greatest king. The chef quickly realized the potential of his purchase. He almost immediately lifted his shackles and gave him his freedom back. He had no children of his own, so he gave him his own name, Raymond of Campania, and named him heir of all of his earthly possessions. The elderly Raymond, being the royal chef, had many connections in the court of Naples, connecting him to some of the most prominent nobles in the realm, something the younger Raymond would learn to use to his advantage. Raymond the Younger was given employment as an assistant chef. He quickly caught on to this craft, all while learning the Italian language of the commoners and the French of the court. Sometime before 1305, Raymond of Campania, the elderly head chef of Naples, died. As promised, his inheritance was given to his adopted son from Africa. Not only this, but he also inherited the role of head chef in the court of King Charles. It appeared ever more so that the king was taking a liking to the freed man. After all, who doesn't like a good cook? But there was more to Raymond than just being a chef. For French being his second or third language, Raymond had such a grasp on it that he was considered to have such a sharp tongue and confident manner that he talked and acted more like a nobleman than much of the court. This bravado kept him alive, and as long as King Charles enjoyed his banter, then he was safe and in a highly desirable position. As Raymond's influence grew with the king, so too did his value as a trusted advisor who had something of an outsider view on courtly matters. He entrusted him so much that he wanted to keep him around as a permanent member of the extended royal family. Charles the Lame wouldn't marry him to any of his own family members. That would just be strategically unviable. To compensate for this, he married Raymond to someone the royal family would always have to monetarily support, the wet nurse to the future ruler of Naples and grandson of King Charles himself. Her name was Philippa of Catania. Born a peasant girl and finding work as a washwoman, she was given the opportunity of a lifetime when she was chosen to nurse the royal baby. Even after the baby was done teething, Philippa would stay employed to help raise the future monarch. A lifetime of yearly stipends from the nobility would follow among other benefits, such as a marriage to a rising noble in the Neapolitan court. The pair would wed in 1304 at the Church of Santa Maria la Nova, located in the city of Naples. On top of marriage, Raymond would also receive his own yearly stipend, separate from the pay he earned in employment to the king. At this point, I will mention the main source for the events on the life of this African knight. His story appears alongside 55 other biographies in the book On the Fates of Famous Men, written by Giovanni Boccaccio, someone I would describe as a historical novelist. He wrote the book at least 20 years after the death of Raymond, and his only two sources for his life are two elderly Neapolitan nobles who only knew the man for a combined handful of years. Keep that in mind while I tell you what happens next. According to Boccaccio, Raymond asked to be knighted before his wedding ceremony. This was granted by King Charles, and perhaps for the first time in history, an African man became a European knight. While we do know that Raymond of Campania was knighted, documents from the court of Naples don't mention his knightly title until 20 years later, all while he is not mentioned as a knight in the years previous. This is likely a fantastical telling of events from Boccaccio. Regardless of when or how, Raymond was most certainly knighted. Raymond and Philippa, both outsiders in the court of nobility, quickly found love, and over the years she would give birth to 3 children. All boys: Carlo, Perotto, and Roberto. None of them would outlive their mother, though. In May of 1309, King Charles the Lame died and was replaced by his son, Robert the Wise. And just as King Charles, his son was also a fan of the nobleman from Africa. He remained employed under his new benefactor. At some point during the early reign of King Robert, Raymond was bestowed with the title of familiaris. This basically meant that he was considered as much as family by the king. Little is known of Raymond for the ensuing decade, but at some point in those years, I would say he was knighted. My best guess is in 1315, when King Robert's son, Charles, the current Duke of Calabria, the heir of Naples raised on the breast of Raymond's wife, was supposed to go to war. He was instructed to reinforce their ally in Florence, who at this time was losing a war with the nearby Republic of Pisa. To keep his son safe on the battlefield and in politics, he knighted Raymond of Calabria and sent him to serve under his son as a familiaris. I make this unproven assumption considering this was Duke Charles's first war. Charles did not even participate in the ensuing Battle of Monteconti, and good thing he didn't. The armies of Naples and Florence would both be embarrassingly defeated by the much smaller Pisan force. Although Raymond was most certainly a knight, we don't have any records of him actually fighting in a battle. It seemed his expertise remained at the court as an influential and trustworthy politician. In the years under the service of Duke Charles, Raymond would be promoted on 3 separate occasions. First, he became the court chamberlain, advisor of the Duke and organizer of the royal household. Sometime after this, Raymond became his marshal, the highest military ranking one could receive in the army. However, being marshal to a duke was far different and more peaceful than a king. Raymond likely used his intelligence to organize the army of Calabria, cutting costs and spending money where he deemed necessary. Sometime in the late 1320s, Raymond received his biggest promotion yet, the title of seneschal, the highest rank receivable in the court, and the second voice of the duke, as well as the possessor of the royal stamp. For Duke Charles of Calabria, Raymond was his Swiss army knife that he could trust to excel in the highest ranks of government. He rewarded Raymond and his wet nurse, Philippa, with extraordinary tracts of land. Over the years, Raymond would come to own his own palace, as well as the governorship and revenue that came along with at least 5 towns. He would also split the ownership and protection of 4 castles with another trusted Neapolitan noble couple. Raymond and Philippa were nothing if not a power couple. At this point, they were some of the most influential figures in the realm, rich beyond both their dreams and friends to the highest order in the land. However, a tragic event hit the royal family in 1328. Duke Charles of Calabria died just before his 30th birthday. He would be buried alongside his ancestors in the Church of Santa Chiara. While this was certainly a blow to Raymond and Philippa as a personal tragedy, it also came with increasing opportunity. King Robert wisely chose to appoint Raymond as his own seneschal. Now, Raymond was at the highest level of power one could receive in the kingdom without being part of the royal family. This position he would remain in until his death. Again, we draw blanks on information regarding Raymond for the next few years. One light does shine through in a court document dated to 1333. In this year, King Robert gave money to Raymond and two of his sons for lending him some of their many horses. They would end up dying while under the king's protection. Only a year after this, King Robert the Wise would pass away and be buried alongside his son in Santa Chiara in January of 1334. His granddaughter and child of Charles of Calabria, Joanna, would become the first ruling queen in the history of Naples. The Kingdom of Naples lost two wise men that year. Raymond would not outlive Robert by much, dying in October. As a sign of his respect, he would be buried alongside the royal family in the Church of Santa Chiara. His tomb remains intact to this day, watching over the royal family in death, just as he had in life. While Raymond's life is over, his children and wife's story is not yet finished. His three sons would all be appointed to various positions of power in the court and promoted to the rank of count. In 1336, the middle son, Perotto, would die, and in 1340 the eldest and chamberlain to Queen Joanna also died. In the year 1345, the rest of Raymond's family would meet a terrible and unjustifiable death. The husband of Queen Joanna, Prince Andrew of Hungary, was assassinated by unknown conspirators. These men were likely nobles of the court who killed Andrew in retribution for his releasing of the Papini brothers. These men were criminals of all brands: rape, plunder, treason, murder, and more. The nobles decided to kill a few birds with only one stone. Soon, whispers of the murderers of Prince Andrew promulgated throughout the streets of Naples. Fingers started to point at the outcast sitting at the tippy top of the court. Raymond's only surviving son, who had become seneschal in his own right, Roberto, was seized by a mob. Here he was executed. He had become the easily identifiable scapegoat for the wrongdoings of the greater nobility. However, his fate was nothing in comparison to the death of his daughter, niece, and mother. Philippa would die in prison, likely from neglect. The last of Raymond's grandchildren would be tortured and burned at the stake. In the grand scheme, no matter what reasons they thought they had, this was simply an act of violent racism. Raymond of Campania, a man who was once a slave from a faraway land, became the right hand of two separate kings and a prince. This is undoubtedly due to the character he possessed within himself. A king living in a society not based on meritocracy, but on birth, made an exception for this capable man out of Africa. His story is very much forgotten. I hope I've done well in finally shedding some light on the African Knight of Naples. A passage of arms is a trial of chivalry developed in medieval Europe. A knight standing alone or with a group of his fellow warriors blocks a path of a popular road. Any commoner or lord who arrived was left undisturbed, but if any knight attempted to pass, he would be blocked by doing so and challenged to a duel, which sometimes ended with first blood, and more often than not, death. If you decline the duel, your chivalry shall forever be marked in shame. The most famous depiction of a passage of arms is undoubtedly the Black Knight from Monty Python. Might I remind you, that he technically never lost. It was a draw and only a mere flesh wound. With great movies out of the way, what is the most famous, historical passage of arms? The answer is the Honorable Pass of Santiago de Compostela, and the 10 knights defending it, led by the most skilled among them, Suero de Canones, or as he is more commonly known, He of the Pass. Before starting our story today, I'd like to give a huge shout out to my collaboration partner, Studium Historiae. He's making a video about medieval Spain as well. More specifically, the theory of convivencia, which means living together. The ideal that medieval Spain was a place of peace, where Muslims, Christians, and Jews all lived together in relative harmony. As we will come to see in our story today, this was not always the case. Suero de Canones was born in 1409 in the Iberian kingdom of Castile. He was the son of a wealthy and landed Leonese noble. Reflecting his privileged upbringing, his father Diego de Canones was known as the Fortunate One, due to his vast riches and bountiful property. The young Suero was given the finest education and especially showed promise in writing. On the other side of his noble education, both Suero and his older brother Pedro were becoming exceptional squires. The two brothers spent a large portion of their teenage years in the Castilian court of John II. The Canones boys would serve under the head of the military and the king's favorite noble, Alvaro de Luna. During his service to the Castilian constable, Suero was knighted shortly before his first major battle. In 1431, a restless Castilian nobility was eager for war. Alvaro de Luna was only too willing to silence them. He intended to end the Reconquista by invading the last Muslim holdout, the Emirate of Granada. In recent years, civil war had weakened the country at the edge of Iberia. Suero Canones accompanied the Alvaro-led Castilian army into Granada. The opposing army, led by the previously overthrown Emir Muhammad the Left-Handed, met him shortly after he crossed the border. The two sides fought over an arid plain with only a single fig tree between them. The battle commenced with the charge of the Castilian knights, the 22-year-old Suero being among them. This bold move paid off, and the Muslim army broke within minutes. The cavalry chased down the retreating men, and by the end of the day, 12,000 lay dead. With Alvaro de Luna's campaign started off on great terms, it soon slowed down, and Alvaro de Luna only found minor successes until returning to Castile without having captured any new territory. This further angered the rowdy nobles, but Suero de Canones was left unfazed, for he knew of a way to claim fame during battle. By 1434, the young knight was in love. To fulfill his chivalric courting and to test his fighting skills, Suero de Canones took 9 fellow fully armored knights and an iron choker to King John II of Castile. He and his company walked into the room and up to the king. He didn't arrest him. Instead, he put the iron choker around his own neck and exclaimed to him that he would wear the choker every Thursday, symbolizing his imprisonment from lack of tangible chivalry and fame. He told King John that he would only release himself when he finally earned renown for killing another knight in a most honorable passage of arms. King John granted Suero and his comrades permission to carry out this knightly duty. Suero swore that the 10 of them would collectively break 300 of their own lances before claiming victory. The knights chose one of the busiest bridges in Spain to consecrate their passage of arms. On the northwest tip of Iberia was the destination of one of medieval Europe's most popular religious pilgrimage sites, the Church of Santiago de Compostela. Just before reaching the church, where all roads combine into one, is the bridge across the Obrigo River. On the far side of that bridge lay a hospital of the Knights Hospitaller, a holy order of knights similar to the Knights Templar that helped escort pilgrims not only in the Holy Land, but also here in Spain. In this place where symbols of religion and chivalry combined is where Suero de Canones set up his trial of the Honorable Pass. The year 1434 was also a Compostela year, a year in which the feast day of St. James, July 25th, fell on a Sunday. This happened every 6, 5, 6, and 11 years in that order. This meant there would be thousands of more people who would take the holy pilgrimage, and plenty of them would be knights. Suero did not only want to become the most chivalrous knight in Europe, but he also wanted everyone to know about it. The personal tourney of 10 knights had turned into its own attraction. Workers hired by the Canones family built bleachers to view, and 22 tents for passing by knights to sleep in while waiting for one of their 10 opponents. Another thing about the 10 guardians of the bridge is that their opposing knights could not pick their opponent. The challengers would choose who they faced. These 10 men were to share the brunt force of splintering at least 300 of their own lances on the armor of their opponent. 30 each one stinging the arm. The tournament started 15 days before the feast day of St. James. By that time, enough knights had showed up to test each one of the riders, some a few times over. By this point in later medieval history, jousting had gone slightly out of fashion, perhaps giving the 10 Knights of Canones an advantage over their challengers. Suero fought on the first day, managing to dehorse the challenger and win, along with the rest of his company. The knight's fame spread along the pilgrimage route. More now joined to watch and challenge the 10. Hundreds lined the Abruzzo River by the second day, and it only grew from there. Suero and the knights went on an unprecedented win streak, not allowing a single knight to pass the old Roman bridge. During the 9th day, Suero claimed his prize. As the rider passed, Canones raised his lance. The strike pierced the opposing rider's left eye, killing him instantly. He freed himself from his iron prison, but 300 lances had not yet been broken. They had just reached over 100 in that day, and the 10 knights were already bruised and bloodied from their many duels. Despite this, they continued on, as their fame attracted ever more talented adversaries. Just imagine how their couching elbow felt by the next day, and the day after that. Soon enough, the 10 knights had been dwindled down to only a few exhausted men, Suero being among them. On the 13th day, 2 days prior to the feast day of St. James, the remaining knights put down their lances and opened the way of the Honorable Pass for all to pass. In nearly 2 weeks, the 10 knights defeated a combined 166 opponents. 300 could never be reached, but more than half of that is an incredible display of skill regardless. After this, Suero de Canones' name was commonplace throughout much of mainland Western Europe. He was a celebrity and a symbol of chivalry incarnate. He would marry his love, whom he had dedicated his many wins to. The Honorable Pass would go down as the greatest passage of arms of all time, and in fact one of the greatest tournaments of all time. In 1434, the start of the eclipse of the medieval knight in Europe. Canones lived a quiet life after his shining moment. Not much is known of him for these years. When he did reappear onto the scene, he would reverse all of the chivalry he had just fought so hard for. In 1449, a 40-year-old Suero Canones was dead broke. His family's lavish lifestyle had finally caught up to them. He was in another prison of sorts, this one being in debt to a Jewish moneylender. During medieval times, the Iberian Peninsula was a place of heavy ethnic and religious diversity. According to the concept of convivencia, or living together, the three religions of Islam, Christianity, and Judaism all lived in relative harmony before 1492. the year when the Reconquista ended with the fall of Granada, as well as the expulsion of the Jews from Spain. As Suero is about to show you, this concept is not wholly accurate. And if you'd like to learn more about Convivenicia, go check out Studium Historiae's latest video. The link will be in the description as well as at the end of this video. For Suero de Canones, the noble knight of the Honorable Pass, there was only one way to solve his money problems, and that was with violence. The Jewish moneylender in question remains unnamed, but resides in the city of Leon. Suero's celebrity status made the crowd gather around him easily as he began preaching about Jewish wrongdoings. He rallied a mob and blamed the Jews collectively for the murder of Jesus. On Good Friday, when Jesus hung on the crucifix, the mob had erupted into open violence in the Jewish quarter of the city. Suero followed them, making sure that they killed his moneylender. The end result was a massacre of most of the Jews in Leon. With his debt erased, Suero de Canones celebrated by drinking wine mixed with lemonade with his anti-Semitic followers. Drinking this so-called Leonese lemonade is still a practice to this day on Good Friday. It is called Mater Judos, or quite literally, killing Jews. While it is claimed to not be an anti-Semitic practice, I don't see a way how you could deny it. With his debt cleared, Suero Canones returned to a quiet life. 7 years later, in 1456, his past would catch up with him. One of the many knights who Canones defeated during his 1434 tournament was a man named Gutierre Quijada. He finally sought revenge 22 years later, and sent one of his men to dispatch of he of the pass. He would kill the once powerful knight. Knights are known for many things: shining armor, kite shields, visored helmets, and lances. But perhaps the most used item in a knight's arsenal is the arming sword. Any knight caught without one might just be a dead man. So what happens if a knight not only loses his sword, but also his entire sword hand? Most would succumb to their condition and leave their adventuring days behind them. But one man overcame this hurdle and added a new item to the knight's arsenal: the Iron Hand. Gotz von Berlichingen was born on November 15th of 1480 in Swabia, located in modern-day southwest Germany. He hailed from a line of minor Swabian nobles. His father, Kilian, was a knight, as was his father before him. Being the fifth-born son to a lesser noble in the Holy Roman Empire meant you did one of two things: join the clergy, or join the cavalry. Gotz only received a military education as his inheritance, but that would prove to be all he needed. By 17, he was knighted and joined the army of his liege lord, who himself was joining the army of the Holy Roman Emperor, Maximilian Habsburg. Gotz immediately saw action fighting in the Low Countries. This, however, only lasted for a year before he returned to Swabia, but he didn't return off duty. In 1499, the Swabian War kicked off. This pitted the armies of the Emperor and the Swabian League, a mutual defense pact inside the Holy Roman Empire, against another, more deadly alliance: the Swiss Confederacy. Opposing the norms of medieval knights, the Swiss warriors were the best pikemen in the world. The now 18-year-old Gotz would bear witness as the Austrian and Swabian armies seemingly fell on the wall of spikes. The Emperor lost this war within a few months. Hereafter, Gotz left the military to forge his own path on the battlefield. The young knight became a mercenary, but not just some lowly Landsknecht. Gotz started his own company of mercenaries and became their captain, aged only 19. Gotz and his hired band traveled all over the Empire, enlisting their services to the Duke or Count with the highest bid. This eventually led him right back to southern Germany. A succession dispute had erupted over the Duchy of Landshut. Duke Albert of Bavaria hired Goths, bolstering his army for the upcoming and surely bloody siege. As promised, this siege would be one to remember, especially for Goths. Sometime during the start of the fight, a stray cannonball hit him on the hand, causing his sword to spin in the air and come down on his arm. The cut was clean, taking the young knight's hand at the wrist. With his hand practically surgically amputated, the doctors could do nothing but bandage his stump. Gotz would recover, but he could never use his sword arm again. His fighting days were over. Gotz fell into a deep depression after this, drinking heavily and ignoring his mercenary band. But he found a renewed sense of hope one day when he saw one of his own men lose his entire arm during a fight. The man didn't concede, but picked his sword right back up with his other hand and continued fighting. This eventually inspired the one-handed Gotz to seek out a particularly skilled blacksmith. He paid the man a hefty sum to create a one-of-a-kind prosthetic, fit for a knight. What the blacksmith, in collaboration with a local saddle maker, produced was a masterpiece of medieval engineering. The iron hand came complete with fingers which could bend to fit around the handle of a sword. Gotz had his sword hand back, and a new reputation to go along with it. Hereafter, he would be known as Gotz of the Iron Hand. This unnamed blacksmith would go on to create another, even more advanced metal hand. The palm was adjustable and each finger could move separately at the joints, leaving it adjustable for any occasion. It was so fine-tuned that he could even use a pen with it. Whoever this blacksmith was, he was well ahead of his time. The iron-handed knight picked his sword back up and never looked back. His years spent inactive turned Gotz into an angry man, willing to start a fight with just about anyone. These fights would eventually turn into feuds, basically the medieval equivalent of a personal and justifiable declaration of war against someone or someplace. Gotz wouldn't just start feuds with people, but also entire cities. For a minor noble, starting a feud was an easy way to make slightly dirty money. Gotz would steal and generally undermine the cities he feuded with. Some knights faked their chivalry. Gotz did not. One particularly long and heated feud was with the city of Nuremberg. In 1512, Gotz would take it a step too far. With a small retinue of his followers, the Iron Hand robbed a merchant caravan on its way to the city. The robber knight would go unpunished as the Holy Roman Emperor stamped an imperial ban on him. This meant that Gotz was confined to his own lands. More importantly, it also made it completely legal to kill him. Usually when an imperial ban happened, the German nobility would pick the band apart. But no one was dumb enough to try that. The imperial ban lasted for 2 years before Gotz was able to pay it off in 1514. After this, he resumed his life as a skilled mercenary captain. It didn't take long before the boisterous Gotz was back to his feuding ways. This time the city of Mainz had angered the iron-handed knight. He and his personal army invaded and subsequently captured a Mainzian count. He thus held the man hostage for ransom and regained all of the cash he had just lost from his imperial ban, plus some. With this refound wealth, Gotz purchased his own castle in 1517, Hornburg. Although a quaint fort, it represented something more than just defense. After being born as a minor noble and inheriting nothing, he now had a castle and an army to man its walls. He wasn't a lord officially, but he might as well have created his own micro-state. And just when everything was getting back on track is exactly when he got another imperial ban. Still, nobody came to kill Gotz, especially now since he was the proud owner of a castle. He paid this ban off soon after it was placed onto him. Gotz managed to anger the Emperor on 2 occasions, and lived to tell the tale. His fame rose alongside his disobedience. Not even a year after his second ban, Gotz of the Iron Hand found his latest contract. Duke Ulrich of Württemberg hired the Iron Hand Knight to fight none other than the Swabian League, who he had fought alongside during the Swiss War. The Duke of Württemberg was on the back end of this war. He stationed his new mercenary company in the border town of MacLeod. The Swabians set a ferocious attack on the village. Gotz and his outnumbered band were surrounded. They fought until their cannonballs ran dry. Then there was no hope that they would win. Before any more could die, Gotz honorably surrendered. As a defeated mercenary in the Holy Roman Empire, tradition permitted that they be released by whoever they surrendered to. But the Swabian League had no issue imprisoning one of their own. Gotz of the Iron Hand would spend the next 4 years in prison. Finally, after so much troublemaking, he was doing his time. By 1522, on the insistence of many fellow knights, Gotz was released and his hand returned. After he paid his ransom, of course. For the next 3 years, Gotz would return to his mercenary work. These days were relatively quiet for the usually loud knight. In 1525, Gotz would find himself in an unusual predicament. Due to a long-standing rivalry between the nobles of the Swabian League and the poverty-stricken commoners, a peasants' revolt broke out, one that wouldn't be matched in Europe until the French Revolution. The rebel commoners came to Gotz's castle, apparently asking if he would be their leader. His reputation among the peasants was one of near reverence. His disobedient nature was inspiring to those who could do nothing against their masters. Gotz was elected supreme leader of the peasant mob, despite putting down a peasant revolt while in the service of Württemberg. He soon directed the popular wrath onto the city of Weinsberg. What followed was an unspeakable massacre of the rich and poor alike. By sacking whole cities, the peasants did more damage to their own cause than they ever did good. For unknown reasons, likely to protect his own life, Gotz retired from his post as peasant leader after a month. Hereafter, he returned to the safety of his castle. Soon enough, up to 200,000 lay dead in front of the Swabian nobles. The revolt had utterly been crushed by the heavy hand of the upper classes. And now that it was over, the Emperor was hunting down their leaders. Gotz of the Iron Hand was at the top of this bounty list. The Imperial Army personally went to his castle and demanded that he and his hired blades surrender. What he said while screaming out his window was probably the greatest comeback in medieval history. "He can kiss my ass." Yes, he quite literally told the Emperor to smooch his touche. This was the first recorded instance of this phrase being used. While he likely didn't invent it, he certainly popularized it. It wasn't long before Gotz would eventually be forced into surrender. He was brought to the Emperor and a court of the highest nobility to answer for his crimes during the Peasants' War. At the Diet of Speyer, Gotz was pardoned of his crime by giving the most bullshit answer. After telling the Emperor to kiss his ass, he told the Diet that he only led the peasants because he thought he could lessen the total destruction that they would cause. The man sacked a whole city and took its wealth only to say, it could have been worse. Somehow, the council bought this ridiculous assertion and let Gotz return to his humble castle. He was promised a safe trip, but upon his arrival, was captured and imprisoned yet again by his own countrymen. This was hardly legal, But the man was a 3-time criminal at this point, so the Emperor just looked away. After spending 2 more years in a Swabian jail, Gotz was released, on the condition that he never leave his own land. And for once, Gotz agreed, finally loosening his metal hand and putting down his sword. He would spend his retirement like any good German would, and began drinking heavily. He also began writing his own story, so everyone could enjoy his fascinating life. The book can still be read to this day, and is the basis for any biography on the prosthetic knight. After spending a decade in an inebriated peace, Gotz would suddenly be thrusted into the front lines of a battle yet again. The Emperor was looking for experienced generals to fight off the growing threat of the Ottoman Empire. Charles Habsburg agreed to lift his house arrest, but only if he would join his military. The knight who told the Imperials to kiss his ass was now leading their army. He remained in Hungary from 1540 to 1542. The fighting was a grogging stalemate throughout most of that time. In 1542, a new front to this war was opened when France invaded the Holy Roman Empire. With assistance from their Ottoman allies, the Austrians were put on the back foot in this conflict. When Gotz arrived, the imperial armies were already planning their counter-invasion of France. The plan would follow through, although it's doubtful that the 66-year-old knight personally saw any real fighting. By 1546, the two-front war came to an end. Nobody won. It was just expensive and useless. With this, the old iron-handed knight returned to his long-overdue retirement. After all of his hardships, the knight went on to live for another 15 years, finally dying in his castle as a blind and handless man at the age of 81. The life of Gotz of the Iron Hand is simply one of a kind. He remains a popular, near-mythical figure in Germany. For many, he was the real-life German representation of a Robin Hood. In his many feuds, he stole from the rich, gave to his poor, merry band of mercenaries, and utterly disobeyed the Emperor's every wish. He was a hero to the lower classes. I mean, doesn't everyone at some point just want to go up to their boss and tell him to kiss your ass? If you ever grow a pair and do that, you can thank Gotz for that feeling. And you can thank him for losing your job. If you'd like to support this Stoic historian, feel free to do so on Patreon for as little as $1 a month. And join Derek Clark, Savaclio Nazarian, Taj Guilford, Nickmate Vossian, Lazarus Dykos, Dave J, and Dalinar. Or become a YouTube channel member like Derek Clark again, Donald Vincent, What? Why? Nickmate Vossian again, GOD, and Heath Hothead 9 Dion. Thank you guys for supporting the channel, I really appreciate it.